10 signs of religious delusion and what it tells us about our brains. Hi, I'm Britt Hartley. I'm an atheist spiritual director at No Nonsense Spirituality. I have a master's degree in theology and I focus on tools for existential crisis, nihilism, and the void. So, number one, a grandiose sense of a divine mission, the belief that you've been personally chosen by a deity or a higher power to fulfill some kind of world changing mission, often without any basis in reality or acknowledgement by others. Number two, feeling like you have a direct communication with God, claiming to hear the voice of God or other supernatural beings. Sometimes this can be auditory, sometimes it can be visual, sometimes it can be both. Number three, belief in special abilities, such as the ability to influence events or heal people or make prophecies. There's some kind of special ability claims there. Number four, claims of religious persecution. So this is intense feelings that you're being persecuted by demons, by the government, by society, by people around you, and it can even lead to really intense paranoia. Number five, refusal of medical treatments or medication, even when health is obviously deteriorating. Number six, seeing patterns from everywhere. Everything is a Bible verse, every number on a billboard, every number on a microwave, every single thing has a message and a meaning, as if the brain is hyper fixated on seeing patterns, even where statistically it is not a pattern. And we can even produce, this ability for the brain to notice patterns and become incredibly superstitious is not something we just see with humans. We can produce superstitions in animals. In the wild, some elephants may display behaviors that look superstitious, like repeatedly tapping on a tree or circling an area after a dangerous encounter. And these actions can be learned as learned associations when you feel a threat or trying to avoid some kind of negative outcome, even if there's no direct link. We've done this with rats. B.F. Skinner has done this with pigeons. We can do this with primates, crows, cats, dogs, horses. Even fish have been observed to be swimming in a particular part of the tank or specific movements in anticipation of being fed. So humans are not the only ones who are able to connect patterns and become superstitious where the pattern is actually not reflective of reality. But humans can do this just with everything around them all the time. And when you get into religious delusion or religious psychosis, that aspect of your brain is just incredibly active. And so everything is a pattern and everything is some kind of message from some higher reality. Number seven, hypergraphy. This is the ability to write a lot in a short amount of time. And as someone who has studied the religious brain for a long time, I've read at least 50 of these things of people who have, claimed revelation, written this, giant book in a week. And, they claim to have figured out biblical prophecy or the nature of the universe. And people, especially men, will send them to me from time to time where they were able to write these really long explorations of theology. And it feels like they weren't the ones writing it. Like it can feel genuinely that it's coming through them and that it's not from them. But the subconscious is completely able to do this. But we see that ability come nearer to the surface when you're in religious psychosis. People can get into flow states and write a lot, but when you're in a religious delusion or in religious psychosis, that ability can be just much more to the surface. And so, it's not uncommon for someone to sit for 3 days and just write and write and write and write. And you can just think like, where is this coming from? Is this guy actually talking to God? But it's something our subconscious is very capable of doing, especially when we have this heightened sense of patterns when we are in psychosis. So number eight, spiritual battles. So this vivid kind of imagery of angels and demons that only they can see. For this one, I especially think of Chad Daybell being able to put a number to people's soul so that they were light or dark, and this eventually leads to the death of Lori Vallow's two children. I super got down that rabbit hole. It happened here in Idaho where I live, and it was really interesting how much religious delusion was a part of this story and a part of that tragedy. Number nine, feelings of guilt or shame that they are not living up to their calling or role. So that can lead to intense religious rituals or scrupulosity, which is kind of like religious OCD. So there can be feelings of guilt or shame associated with their call. And then number 10, apocalyptic beliefs, a fixation on end times or apocalyptic events, believing that they have secret knowledge about how the world will end and how it will unfold. And they might obsessively start to prepare for these events, such as hoarding supplies or isolating from society based on specific dates or visions. Now, how the religious psychosis expresses as far as beliefs depends on the culture. So, if you're in the West, you're going to think you are Jesus or you're Elijah or you're preparing for the second coming. There's going to be lots of biblical pattern stuff. Second coming, end of the world stuff. And in the East, you're much more likely to believe that you're a reincarnation of a bodhisattva, like a future Buddha. Maitreya is an example of that, or a significant figure from Hindu mythology, such as an avatar of Vishnu. You might claim to have special knowledge about how we're going to restore Dharma at the end of the world. There could be an obsession with natural disasters as signs of cosmic events. You can get involved into astrology and still have this be part of religious psychosis or religious delusions. And you may even be able to interpret visions or dreams or encounters with local deities or spirits as part or proof of your divine mission. So in Japan, you might believe you're a mountain ascetic and that you're going to survive a coming apocalypse, and you've been chosen to prevent it by performing certain sacred rituals. So how this appears will depend on the culture that you're in. But let's focus on the West because I have a lot more experience with how this shows up in an Abrahamic religion context. So what religion tells us about the brain, it's telling us a lot about ourselves because the subconscious is actually very active rather than being repressed. So we have thousands of people right now who check off all of the boxes of religious delusion. There are many people right now who are claiming to be Jesus, and they can't all be right. So what is actually going on here? What happens with religious psychosis is rather than things being compartmentalized and curbed by society and societal norms and repressed in your subconscious, it's like your brain went through a blender so the subconscious world becomes reality. It's like the dream becomes real. And this actually can teach us a lot about ourselves and what creates religion in the first place. So, what do we learn about the fact that we can go into these states and there's such similarities between people who have religious delusions and religious psychosis? So we learn that we are pattern seeking and meaning making creatures, and that our brains do that on its own. We don't choose to see patterns. We're not necessarily looking for them consciously. Our brains do that entirely on their own. The human brain is wired to seek patterns and impose meaning on the world, even when none exists. And so religious delusions often involve seeing symbolic connections in random events, numbers, phrases, experiences, and this reveals the brain's deep-rooted desire to find order amongst the chaos, make sense of just a complex, unpredictable world by inventing narratives or divine messages. And this pattern-seeking tendency likely evolved as a survival mechanism. It helped us to recognize threats or see opportunities in our environment, but we got so good at trying to see patterns that we actually now oversee patterns where the data actually shows there's no correlation. But our brains don't know that it feels very real. We also learn that we are afraid of uncertainty and we are afraid of death. So, religious delusions, especially fixated on apocalyptic scenarios or divine missions, expose the brain's response to existential fears, particularly our fear of death. So, by creating stories and belief systems that offer explanations for death or cosmic purpose, it's the brain's way of constructing a buffer against the terror of meaninglessness. And we can watch someone do this so much more acutely when they're in religious psychosis rather than someone whose, brain is well regulated, where that's only happening in the background and it's really hard to see. So in a regulated brain, this is all repressed and shoved into the subconscious, but that isn't happening when you're in psychosis. And so you can actually see that buffer against the terror of meaninglessness and death be created and shifting in real time. Another thing we learn is that we seek control when we feel powerless to the chaos and when we feel the randomness of the world. So, in religious delusions, individuals often believe that they are central to cosmic events and possess some kind of special powers or special knowledge. And this highlights the brain's need for agency and control in the face of powerlessness. So, by positioning themselves as key figures in a divine plan or apocalypse, people can regain a sense of control over their lives, even when it seems like everything is falling apart. And this can be seen as an extreme manifestation of how the brain is trying to remain empowered and in control, even when confronted with overwhelming forces like natural disasters or societal decay. We also learn the capabilities of the human subconscious, that these people really can just go into a room for 3 days without sleeping or eating and will write hundreds and hundreds of pages that you can read. I've read many of these, and we can learn more about what our subconscious is capable of when it is hyperactive in religious psychosis rather than suppressed and just kind of puppet mastering things from the background, from the dark of our attention. So we can actually learn a lot about what our own brains are capable of. We also learn how much our brains depend on a story for us, for our sense of identity in the world. So, believing that you're Jesus or Elijah or a reincarnated bodhisattva illustrates how the brain uses culturally significant stories to give you some kind of personal identity that you need in a moment of crisis or instability. So, the adoption of these grandiose messianic identities during powerful delusion episodes suggests that stories in the subconscious gives us a framework for our place in the world, especially when our sense of self is feeling very fragile or feeling very threatened. And the brain, we can watch how the brain deals with this in how we create stories about our place in the universe. And again, it's more subtle with a regulated brain. It's much more apparent when you can watch someone do that in real time in religious psychosis. We also learn how much cultural imprinting happens in the brain. We see this when religious delusions take on the form of their culture. Even if, that person in their more sober state, they might say that they don't have any specific beliefs. They might not have even gone to church. I've known people who really didn't have, a childhood where they went to church and, had a Christian upbringing, but it'll still show up in their religious delusions or religious psychosis because that's just, we're just baked in the culture that we are raised in. We learn the role of the subconscious and that our brain is complex enough and capable enough to ask and answer its own questions and feel like it's not coming from you. And this is so much of what Revelation seems to be, the brain being able to ask and answer its own questions. And because we have compartmentalized and we have this tiny sliver of our conscious mind and our attention, but there's so much else going on in the brain, it really does feel like it's coming from God and not from us. But we can see that it absolutely is capable of coming from us. So during religious psychosis, the boundaries between subconscious thought and conscious thought and subconscious processing, that can all blur and start to blur together, which allows repressed fears and repressed desires, unresolved conflicts, beliefs. It can allow us to essentially see what's going on in our subconscious mind when that's usually not so accessible to our conscious mind when we're not in psychosis. We learn also that we want to be important, and especially we want our lives to have meaning. The belief in divine communication, apocalyptic beliefs, special powers, it reflects the brain's attempt to compensate for feelings of inadequacy or trauma, or that we're not special or we're not loved or we're marginalized. And in these cases, religious delusion might offer some kind of psychological refuge and escape to this alternative reality where you feel significant and you feel protected by cosmic forces. Religious delusions, when viewed without the assumption of a divine presence, because they can't all be Jesus, highlights our deep, deep need for meaning, control, and purpose in a world that often feels indifferent or chaotic. And at the same time, it also shows the brain's remarkable ability to generate complex narratives and reality in order to function psychologically with all of our subconscious needs and desires. So, this is why when someone asks, "How are you an atheist?" Did you look into every corner of the universe and find that there is no God? Obviously not. But when you spend time learning about the religious brain and also watch our collective religious brains across time and history and all of the stories and gods and rituals and ways to cheat death that we come up with eventually, while I was in theology school, mind you, it eventually left me with the thought that we are the ones creating gods. And there's a lot of evidence of that. And so my atheism doesn't come from the fact that I've explored every corner of the universe. It's from studying religious brains and specifically what happens in religious delusion and religious psychosis, which is actually showing us what our brains, all of our brains, are doing underneath the surface of our attention, and how we're creating these stories individually but also collectively, and how it changes over time based on whatever's going on in the culture at the time in order to face everything that we're having to face psychologically, subconsciously. So some questions that I get asked a lot: what do I do when someone I know is in a religious delusion or a psychosis episode? Why doesn't religion say anything about it or do anything about it? And is all religion then just various shades of religious delusion? So, first of all, what to do when someone you know is in this kind of state. And I'm using the terms religious delusion and religious psychosis interchangeably, but they are different and there is some overlap. So, with psychosis, you'll have all of the elements of religious delusion, but it's referring to a broader mental state where you start to really lose touch with reality altogether. And that's when it gets pushed into psychosis. But for either one, what can you do? And I can make a whole video on this, but essentially the short answer is empathy, not challenging directly and encouraging professional help is the way to go, because directly challenging stresses out their psyche, which in turn causes them to cling to the delusion more. So this was the theme of a movie, which was a book about a real story called The Three Christs of Ypsilanti. And it was in a psychiatric hospital. It's a true story in Ypsilanti, Michigan. And it was an experiment conducted by psychologist Milton Rokeach, where he asked the question, what happens when you put three Jesuses in a room? And so he facilitated these group meetings because there were three men who believed that they were Jesus, and he put them together to see what would happen when they confront each other's beliefs about being Jesus, because each man believed that he was the true Christ and viewed the others as imposters. So they engaged in arguments. They were trying to convince the others that they were wrong. And instead of that kind of shattering their delusion, the men developed elaborate explanations to explain the existence of other Christs and why they were wrong and why they were right. So, for example, one believed that the others were just patients with severe mental illness, and another thought that they were actually dead or had been put under some form of deception by the doctors. And essentially, the Three Christs of Ypsilanti experiment failed in its objective because the delusions of the three men were not resolved, and the confrontation did not lead them to challenge their own beliefs. Instead, the men found ways to preserve their own realities, and they would sometimes even incorporate the others' claims into their own delusional framework. So over time, we came to realize that the methods of challenging delusions, especially like really confrontationally like that, is ethically questionable because they were actually more sure about their delusions than less. Simply telling someone they're wrong or placing them in situations where their beliefs are directly being challenged doesn't actually lead to insight. The stress of it actually leads to further entrenchment of the delusion. So, the lesson we learned, not just from this case, but thousands of others, is that people with religious delusions should be treated with respect and empathy. Because if they're doing this because they have a need to feel safe or special, we can actually, if this is a friend or family member, help them come out of the delusion by helping them feel safe and loved and special. Then, in a good, safe relationship, rather than forcing insight, we can work gradually to help the person regain some connection to reality, usually through some kind of medication, counseling, and building trust over time. So, creating a safe, supportive environment where the person feels understood is crucial in managing psychosis. Even something like helping a person get on meds can be presented with love and care for their mental state, or, how little you're sleeping, and we're just trying to help you, and, just help you feel better, rather than take this pill so that you stop being Jesus because you're wrong. Like, that's not going to go anywhere, because so much of this is also around identity. We can redirect that towards healthier ways of having identity. So rather than trying to strip away the delusion, it can be helpful to redirect the person's focus to healthier coping mechanisms, ways to feel special and loved just in the world and in their family and in relationships, and activities that still allow for meaning and purpose, but in a more grounded way. So this is very difficult to do, but at the very least, we can say that this can happen to anyone. Anyone can be in a cult. It's not something that, something that only happens to people who are gullible or people who are dumb. Very, very smart, accomplished people can get into cults, can get into religious delusions, can even get into states of mind where they're in full-on religious psychosis. This can happen to anyone, and it's our subconscious fears and desires getting mixed in with our conscious mind. And the more that we learn about the brain, hopefully the more we can meet that person with compassion, rather than just like banging our head against a wall trying to convince them that they're wrong. So, what does religion have to say about religious delusion and religious psychosis? They really try to distance themselves from it, and they just call it a mental health issue that is completely unrelated to religion, and they have to do that. I have messages from so many women, especially women, who said that this happened to their husbands, and their church not only didn't help, but sometimes the local church was supportive of the delusion, because the church cannot outrightly say God's not talking to you, because that undermines the concept of revelation. And it can't say God didn't help write that book, because then it calls into legitimacy how scripture is written at all. And it can't say you're getting a little too intense with the second coming stuff, because that belief is central to doctrine. And it can't put out a checklist saying, hey, if you think you're a prophet, you might have some religious delusion, because then that calls into question previous prophets. So because all of this is too close to the tenets of religion and just moderate religion, most religious communities are not only not going to be helpful, they're actually going to be more harmful. They're going to encourage this. And this can be so damaging to the families that are involved, because the average person is also being driven by subconscious fears and desire for story and patterns and subconscious desires and a desire to have control. All of that is happening with the average person too. So religions really don't have the ability to call out the Chad Daybells until something terrible happens, and then it's just mental illness. That's really the only thing that they can do, because it's too close to what moderate religion is, which leads me to my final point here. We don't know what's going on with ultimate reality. Certainly I don't know. The ones who know the most about, objective reality are our neuroscientists, our quantum physicists. They just talk about how mysterious and counterintuitive reality is, and really just how little we know. And the more we come to know, the more we come to realize we don't know shit about fuck.
This is crazy. I don't know shit about fuck.
Ruth.
And I don't know how life began or what consciousness is or any of that. But one thing that religious psychosis teaches us is that by bringing the subconscious to the surface and seeing what it does, we're able to learn about our own brains and why we create gods and heavens and religions. Now, some atheist agnostic types are just going to say, yeah, fuck religion. It's all supernatural stories being driven by our subconscious needs and desires. But here's the thing. We evolutionarily developed religion to deal with everything going on in our psyche. And if you don't replace those anchors, it can be difficult to orient yourself in the world. It can make you susceptible to making a religion out of something else, like a political party or CrossFit or something else. It makes you susceptible to the void, where you don't have any anchors at all and you have just total existential crisis. Or it can make you susceptible just to seek pleasure and just get on the dopamine hamster wheel. So the work now of people leaving organized religion is only the beginning. We're in the very baby stages of this, because that's still going to leave a vacuum behind, because we have to find ways as a society, individually and communally, to create meaning, to feel like our lives matter, to deal with our fears of death, to find identity and belonging in our place in the world, to handle anxiety around the fact that we're born without knowing why in a universe that doesn't care, and we're trying to figure out what we are and what's going on in this random and very chaotic world. We're at the very beginning stages of this process. So when I look back at my own time in religion, in theology school, in apologetics, in religious studies, what I thought I was doing was reason and philosophy. I truly thought I was being rational, that I was just trying to make sense of God, trying to find God, and doing it in a way that made sense. I had no idea that the reasons that I was looking for God or trying to find ways to hold on to God was because of my deep subconscious things going on: fear of meaninglessness, desire to be part of my family, desire to keep my marriage together, desire for there to be truth, because I had an identity as a truth seeker. And who was I if there was no truth? And my desire for life to matter, and my desire to cheat death, and my desire to make suffering all okay, and that it's someday going to be all okay. I thought I was doing religion. I thought I was looking for God. But my beliefs over the years had a lot more to do with me than the idea that I was getting anywhere as far as like figuring out what was going on in the universe. So that's true for me too. I'm not saying this from a judgmental place. I'm saying this as I did this too. It just didn't turn into full on psychosis where it's at the forefront for everyone to see. I was doing it more subtly and more subconsciously. So, as a spiritual director, I will never challenge someone's beliefs directly, just like we don't when someone's in religious psychosis. What I do is work with what your beliefs say about you. That's where the real work is. That's where the real journey is. What are you anxious about? What are you looking for? What do you want to be true? And so you're making it true by clinging to these stories. What are your fears around death? What are your existential fears? What are the stories that you've constructed to confront that? And is there a better tool if you find yourself, not being able to believe that story or having cognitive dissonance with that story? So that is where the real journey is. But I didn't see it because it was so subconscious and I thought I was being rational. So stay tuned for more no nonsense spirituality, for tips on how to build things like healthy identity, community, spirituality, psychological danger or anchors, not dangers, psychological anchors, and tools just for how to orient yourself in life without superstition or without the supernatural. And as always, no nonsense required.